Feedback in Creative Writing, a learner-centered teaching approach. I'm Kathleen Coleman, and today we're going to look at how to use learner-centered teaching specifically in the creative writing classroom, but also what learner-centered teaching is overall. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to do the following: describe the basic definition of learner-centered teaching, and create a more meaningful feedback experience between instructor and student that puts the bulk of the work and learning on the student rather than the instructor. Learner-centered teaching is a teaching style that puts the bulk of the work element of a lesson onto the student rather than the instructor. Having students do the work reinforces material for them. Learner-centered teaching, or LCT, may be more difficult for the instructor and unfamiliar to the student, but it provides greater depth of understanding and retention. Research in neuroscience, biology, and psychology shows through a variety of studies that students learn best when they are the ones doing the bulk of the work with course material. Teacher-centered learning, involving a high degree of lecture, objectively graded assessments, and material delivered to the students rather than the students generating much of the material and work, is seen as easier and more pleasant for both student and teacher, but this does not mean it's more effective at ingraining the material in students' minds for the long term. Teacher-centered learning is generally what students are more familiar with and involves a high degree of lecture and assignments that do not cover higher-level learning objectives. This style of teaching puts more control in the teacher's hands rather than in the students and allows teachers to control the learning situation. However, this approach does not actually allow students to have any stake in their own learning. They are taught at rather than asked to engage with the material. Flipping the learning situation, having students do the bulk of the work and share in the responsibilities for learning, puts the teacher in the role of facilitator and students in the roles of participants rather than passive receptors. In Terry Doyle's 2011 book, Learner-Centered Teaching, Putting the Research on Learning into Practice, he discusses ways in which LCT can actually result in the activation of reward systems in the brain, and that the oft-touted concept of neuroplasticity does have some limitations. That simply doing brain exercises does not necessarily translate into making your brain work better at all tasks and concepts. It simply makes you better at doing that specific type of activity. Instructors should want students to be able to apply information to the real world through an apprenticeship model rather than learning concepts in a void, completely divorced from practical application. Terry Doyle discusses daydreaming, multitasking, the brain's need for rest, and whether drugs can positively impact the capacity for learning. Collaboration, physical aerobic exercise, and creating student-focused learning opportunities are all ways in which instructors can encourage students to learn better and more effectively with longer-term retention. Each of these can have great influences on learning complex material and being able to apply it. By staying current on research on pedagogy and learning, teachers can better adapt their teaching styles as new and better ideas are discovered and reported. Continuing to teach the same class over and over again in the same style does nothing to account for new discoveries in educational psychology, and teachers who do not address these pedagogical developments are in danger of wasting students' time. Terry Doyle repeatedly advocates for teaching the students we have, not the students we believe we have. The students we have must be related to on their own terms, and one way to learn what their terms are is to read pedagogical research. In Alan Ziegler's 2008 The Writing Workshop Notebook, the focus is on creating a functional workshop model, that is, a class structure emphasizing critique for peer and instructor review of students' creative work. A workshop typically involves peer and instructor feedback of submitted creative writing, which could include poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, or all of the above. The LCT method can be of obvious use in the creative writing classroom, particularly by having students evaluate each other's work for specific elements instructors lay out for them. This could involve short, directed lectures discussing just one topic, which then the instructor assigns peer reviewers to seek out in their classmates' writing. By keeping the lecture brief, focused, and then immediately applying the information, students are engaging with the material rather than simply trying to absorb it without relevancy. Even as Terry Doyle makes clear, it isn't that lecture should never be used, as it's helpful for describing a specific piece of background information. The fiction writing instructor who gives his or her class a brief lesson on a concept the class needs to work on, for example, curtailing writers' overuse of adverbs, why this might not be an effective writing approach, and how to strengthen verbs to avoid the need of quite so many adverbs, could then encourage students to focus their peer evaluations on that particular area. Another lesson could involve another writing concept, and so on. In this way, the instructor is not even necessarily giving direct feedback to individual students, but rather is giving the students the quick tool needed to self and peer edit based on the concept of the day. Students, therefore, feel a sense of ownership and autonomy over the concept that they would not have gotten had the concept and critique simply been fed to them by the instructor. In describing how to facilitate a learner-centered class, Terry Doyle goes into great detail about the need and best practices for giving meaningful feedback, including a method whereby students are asked to summarize their own feedback as a way of reinforcing and ensuring that it has been read and understood by the student. For people outside of the field of creative writing instruction, there is the perception that it's impossible to grade or assess, primarily because art is subjective. Therefore, some people believe that the only things an instructor can grade on are mechanics, rendering us essentially copy editors for our students. Not only does copy editing not help your students and should be avoided, there are legitimate components of literary theory and storytelling that can be taught, and these require instructors and peers to give feedback to students. Usually in a workshop setting, students and instructors may be responding to and discussing one student's work, sometimes with students seated in a circle, and each one taking turns to talk about the work under review. The most useful element of Terry Doyle's material here focuses on the method of feedback and having students not only read and understand it, but summarize it in order to better ingrain the items needing revision in their head. It's easy to read a piece of feedback on one's writing, for example, seeing that you need to insert a comma or watch your word choice in certain scenes, and even to revise to fix it. A student could see that he or she has ongoing issues with comma usage, read and understand the feedback, fix the necessary spots in the story, and then promptly forget the entire comma lesson, only to repeat it in the next submission. By forcing the student to not only fix the error, but beforehand to summarize why he or she was making the error in the first place, to restate the instructor's notes pertaining to that error, that alone will help the student remember before making the same mistake again. Writing instruction generally, not just creative writing, can obviously benefit from this approach. By having students actually do the summarizing, it puts the onus on them to do the work, which is fundamental in LCT. There is a heavy amount of feedback given in most writing classes, from poetry to freshman composition, and at times it's overwhelming for the student to absorb. Turning in a summary of the advice can also nip problems in the bud if the student is misunderstanding what he or she is being advised. To sum up, in this lesson we covered defining learner-centered teaching, creating a more meaningful feedback experience between instructor and student, and designing an assignment for writing feedback based on LCT principles. For more information, consult Terry Doyle's Learner-Centered Teaching, Putting the Research on Learning into Practice, and Alan Siegler's The Writing Workshop Notebook, Notes on Creating and Workshopping.